Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is the wonderful Maggie Dent. She is commonly known as the Queen of Common Sense and has become one of Australia's favourite parenting authors and educators. In particular, she has a strong interest in the early years, adolescence, and resilience. Maggie's experience includes teaching, counselling, and working in palliative care / funeral services, along with suicide prevention. Maggie is an advocate for the healthy common sense raising approach of children in order to strengthen families and communities, and she's incredibly passionate about children of all ages. Maggie is regularly featured on parenting blogs, podcasts, and news sites, as well as being heard on commercial and ABC radio around the country. She also appears regularly on the national TV. Maggie is the host of the ABC podcast Parental As Anything. She's author of 9 major books, several ebooks, and is a prolific creator of resources for parents, adolescents, teachers, early childhood educators, and others who are interested in simply improving lives. Maggie is the proud mother of 4 children, 4 sons, and an enthusiastic and grateful grandmother. She lives on the south coast of New South Wales with her good bloke, Steve Mountain. This is on her biography, and their dear little dog, Mr. Hugo Walter Dent. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Maggie Dent. Maggie Dent, a real big appreciation and thank you for coming on to the show today.
Oh, just thank you for having me. I love a good chat.
Look, I think we've got so much to chat about. I know that you're, incredibly and prolific in your writing. You've written something recently, but there's a lot of books, particularly in, working with young people raising kids. I know that you've got a strong background in a dip ed and a counselling degree as well. You've got so much experience, but the thing that maybe comes to mind first is, how did you get into that space, and how have you found yourself writing so deeply and heavily in this area?
It's so funny, Nesh, because I was a high school English teacher. So, if there's anything that puts you off writing for yourself, it's correcting English essays and so. And so when I had my own, I went off to become a mum. I had I was actually a stay-at-home mum for around 7.5 years. I ended up having 4 boys. And it was kind of when I came back and realised I was a much better teacher because I'd been a parent. My patience was amazingly better with those adolescent boys. And then, I kind of realised that I had always had a knack for the troubled kids finding me in high schools. And they would find me, at lunchtime or on my way to the car or after class. And one day I just had that little epiphany that I think anyone can teach kids how to write paragraphs, and maybe I should, be more available for the troubled kids. So I did that diploma in counselling and therapy and stepped out of a classroom. And then when I started working with those, and it was from kids from 4 to, 18, and then the grown-ups who came in with a broken child inside them, I thought, well, if you work with a troubled kid, particularly a teen, you need to work with the family. So then I started running little seminars, and they kept saying, oh, God, I wish someone explained it like that before. I could have got on board with that. And then I burned out because I didn't have really good boundaries. I wanted to help every single troubled child in my whole community. And then when I was in that space, spending some time walking on a beach with my dog and reflecting, I thought I might just put it in a book. And so my first book was born, 2003, which was Saving Our Children from Our Chaotic World, Teaching Children the Magic of Silence and Stillness, which is hilarious, right? Because it wasn't even that crazy then. We didn't have COVID. We didn't have the digital world. What was I thinking? And then so accidentally, as the teacher in me was still there very much. And I think I brought a different voice to the space of parenting, because I had been the counsellor, the teacher, and the parent. I think the three legs on the stool gave me a slightly different voice. I wouldn't let people attack parents, and I wouldn't let them attack teachers. And I kept saying, look, help-seeking behaviour is really helpful. But I didn't see it going this way, Ness. I didn't see that insatiable hunger that I have for being in service of some kind. My dad was an amazing humanitarian, and I think I've probably based, I've been raised, how can you help your community? How can you help others? That's just, that was embedded in me. And so it's kind of been an accidental ride, and I have absolutely no idea how I've got to this kind of spot now. I've written my 10th major book, but I've written a lot of, like a good teacher, I've written all sorts of mini books and e-books that I often gift away to people and organizations, because my attachment isn't to kind of how much money can I make or how famous I can get. It really is, how can I be a catalyst for positive social change, especially in our families and our schools and our communities. And so it's kind of a ride that I never know what's around the corner. I never knew I was going to end up being a host of a podcast. And when I started to do the little videos that I have on YouTube, and I have over 120 now, my motivation then was I'd been working in remote Aboriginal communities, and a lot of the young mums were telling me they wanted to be different. They wanted to raise their kids in healthier ways, but they had such low literacy, they were never going to read my books. So then I thought, well, and I asked them, and they said, oh, we like videos. So really it was those lovely Aboriginal girls who are probably now, 40, who gave me the idea that I could create free content in little bite-sized pieces that could be really relatable and easy to understand. And it was well ahead of anybody doing it. So like I said, sometimes just ideas pop into my head in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning or when I'm walking. And look where it's got me.
I think what's really lovely from what you say is that approach or that perspective of not allowing anyone to be negative about whether it's teachers or parents, but rather seeking an understanding and getting your mindset from that space to look at the problem, and therefore not seeing it as a blame on someone, but rather, how can we do this better? And obviously that's where I'm hearing has informed a lot of your work. It's not trying to go out and point the finger, but rather, examine it and be considerate and saying, well, how do we solve this? How do we look at this? How do we understand it? And that's something that's, I think, really beautiful in what you do.
I think also I accidentally, while I was an at-home mum, ended up stumbling into a couple of other experiences that helped shape me. I'd always wanted to be a newsreader, and the ABC was looking for something in Albany in WA, which is the bottom of the state, it's a long way away. And they wanted to have someone who could look after some afternoon sessions. And I thought, I could probably do that. That's only a few hours. And so that little taster in that space was lovely in terms of what I do now. But it meant I got to meet other interesting people coming in, sharing stories. And then also I ended up volunteering at the beginning of the Albany Hospice, which was obviously, palliative care is an area I never thought I'd ever step into, because I thought that'd have to be the most depressing work on the planet. And of course, that was, in terms of my passion for resilience and how do we navigate this strange dance called life, a really good place to learn about it is at the end of it. And I kind of, accidentally realized that I was really good at feeling comfortable in that space. And I don't know if it's because I was the farm kid and we had a lot of dead animals. I'm not quite sure. But it was just something that, so I became basically a death doula around the edges. Not only did we support families before, during and after, But if a family wanted to have a loved one die at home, then, we could facilitate that. And you're exactly right. If you build the understanding of what may be going to happen and prepare people, then they're much braver in that moment. And then I ended up working in the funeral industry. So I did everything in the funeral industry, from, preparing bodies to driving coaches and stretch limousine hearses, making sure you don't knock a headstone over. And then I saw there were some pretty terrible ceremonies of farewelling. So I was already an authorised marriage celebrant. So I started doing funeral ceremonies, and that really is an incredibly powerful place to learn how people navigate such adversity. And it was the most uplifting work, I could possibly ever do. And that kind of brought through with my work when I work with families. So we help you understand that there's no perfect journey. If you have children, you're not going to run around in a field of daisies, because there will be prickles. And some days it's going to be freezing, and other days it's going to be glorious with a full moon arising. You know what I mean? I kind of wanted parents to realize you can't do perfect parenting, because we're humans and living in systems like families. We don't all get it right, and we have days when we don't feel good, and especially when you're sleep deprived. So helping them be more realistic in appreciating that there are gifts and challenges in every stage of our kids' lives and our own. Holy heck, I ended up in perimenopause with a 14-year-old who was incredibly challenging. We couldn't remember anything either way. And so I think that's what I've been able to do, create a way of being more realistic and understanding that you're not a lousy parent, you're not a lousy human. And when we work together, we can help overcome things. I think I kept finding parents wanting to fix too much and do too much, the same as I saw organisations when they went out and worked in some of our scattered communities with our First Nations people. They wanted to walk in there and just do stuff without working with them. And I think that's probably, I hope, what I've been able to do, because I listen very deeply to the voices, not only of children and teens and parents, but educators and those who work in the field of allied health, because I think when we're all on the same page, we've got a better chance of us helping get through the toughest things, particularly, traumatic events like an ongoing pandemic.
That really resonates for me in terms of the attitude of trying to fix. In order for there to be a fix, there has to be a problem, there has to be a diagnosis, there has to be something that we can categorize as being, bad. And it's such a different space of saying this isn't necessarily about fixing. If we kind of shift that paradigm, maybe we move across more to a process. Parenting is a process, and children go through phases. I'm a young sort of father myself, and I can see how this is only stage one of an entire life of being a parent. and as much as I know very little, in many ways I probably don't need to know that much. No. That being nurturing and trying to actually being curious, trying to understand, being curious, trying to figure it out. It probably allows me to pick up some of those things. It doesn't mean that I can't approach people like yourself, or read your books or other good, look up other good blogs and podcasts. But it's very process. So when you say fixing, whether it's from teachers or parents, that really resonates, because I think there's a huge difference in those two distinctions.
Oh, look, and it's really interesting, because every now and then I'm apparently highly recognisable, regardless of where I am, or whether I've got makeup on or not, or matching shoes, because I'm a bit prone to not matching my shoes. And just recently I was at a really huge early childhood conference on the Gold Coast, which is a spectacular event obviously hasn't been there for 3 years, where, they really do dive into what we need them to know in that early window of life. And I had so many come up to me and say, this book, and the one that this woman said, my husband and I use it as a Bible from boys to men, helping them understand their teen son. That has been a game changer in our house. when we're struggling with him, we go back and check the index on your book and we look at different ways of communicating or different ways of understanding why he is disengaging, why he's angry. And then we have these conversations after we've fed him. And you know what? Look, things just settled down so much quicker. We were just stumbling around in the dark. And then I'll run into a mum who says, mothering our boys changed my life. I had no idea how different. I was raised in a family of girls with an only mum, no idea. And your book just lifted the light for me. And I have this beautiful relationship with my son. And I just want to thank you for that. So you're right that, you know, when we stumble along and not sure and we want to find some solutions, I don't offer a one-size-fits-all solution. I'll offer a whole heap of things that give you insight into what may be under that. And so often when I'm on radio, people ring up and say, oh, my 3-year-old is, and I'll go, you do realize that is developmentally absolutely normal and important. And they'll just go, is it? And I that, oh my God, is that? I'll go, yes. Because if a child's not striving for their own autonomy, they're not going to become an individuated human, which means they'll be their own person later. This is exactly what has been happening since we started having these little cherubs. Now, I'll give you a couple of suggestions that may make that a little easier, but I want you to know that's happening in all homes. You're not failing. And go make yourself a cuppa and sit down and eat a Tim Tam whenever it's going down, because, the calmer you are, the whole experience is going to be easier for both of you.
And that's a big part as well of having some reassurance that we're doing the right job. I know that Matthew Sanders, speaking with him about the Triple P program, and so much about that is also about just trying to regulate, just sort of pumping the brakes, so to speak, being settled and grounded yourself. That is a good position or platform to begin to try and understand our children, and say, what are their needs? Why might they be, acting out, or maybe not even acting out, just behaving that way? Because it's not necessarily acting out; it's behaving and trying to express themselves in a particular way. And for us as parents, we're trying to decode what might that mean, and why is that coming up right now, or what's the secondary gain that's coming from there, or how am I reinforcing, or what am I reinforcing, and so on. So it's a bit of a maze, but I think that curiosity helps, and you've got that in spades.
I think the other thing that a lot of parents, we're coming from the behaviorism, influences. And I was raised at a really tough time where, obviously children were being naughty. They needed to be shamed or smacked or sent outside or whatever, and the changes in, the science of child development has been really helpful. But one of the key ones too is even your teenager doesn't necessarily have an intentionality between the choices of calling you a deadhead and telling you to where to go. It's deliberately choosing to be naughty. That's the transition, I think, as we're getting through this, that we all behave badly when we're flooded with cortisol, let's be honest. And I think that's kind of taking a lot of time. We know it's, we know that when we recognize, I really agree with Dr. Ross Green, that really basically kids will behave well if they can. And I noticed that in my classrooms, that the more welcoming my classroom, the more inclusive my classrooms, the friendlier I was, I had less behaviour issues, even from the kids who I knew were struggling because they were basically illiterate or they had ADHD. When I created a classroom that wasn't stressful, their behaviour was easily much noticeably different. And I did have some teachers who were very old school challenging me, saying, I'd just kick them out when they like that. And I'm going, what are they learning? How are they learning skills to be able to navigate your classroom if that's the only option and you do it within seconds? And the kids are sitting outside classrooms. So often they were First Nations kids. And I just, instinctively knew that we can work with these kids to build those levels. And obviously, I was a bit weird because I started doing mindfulness, which wasn't called that in the olden days. I just knew, because I'd actually had a panic attack on ABC radio at one point before I went back full-time teaching. And it sent me on a journey of understanding anxiety. And so I started bringing that into classrooms. We do deep breathing and we do visualizations before we did our major assessments. We'd have a 10 or 12-minute relaxation after lunch on the floor. And I started seeing such a shift in behavior, but also, wait for it, educational outcomes. I saw kids thinking more deeply because they weren't so stressed. I saw them, I just couldn't believe it, because I was only doing it to make the classrooms less noisy. And that really started a whole different thing for me. So when I write, the first book, Saving Our Children, I aimed it for parents, but I also aimed it for teachers who are interested in maybe stress is contributing to an unpleasant classroom environment. And when I wrote it, I was waiting. Oh my God, Nesh, I was waiting for a teacher to kind of contact me and say that book's full of rubbish, or a psychologist, because of course none of this had any science behind it, no evidence behind it at that stage. Oh, you're just some woo-woo fluffy, or a parent. And it was so funny. I was kind of about a month in, and I had a principal email me and say, look, I just wish every parent would read this book. And then I had parents saying, I wish every teacher would read this book. And then I had some psychologists who I, had known, who work in schools, saying, this is gold. And then, of course, eventually we were able to show it, aren't we? That mindfulness is absolutely incredibly important for lowering anxiety and stress. So it was kind of sweet being validated up well after it was. And there are times, when I was working in my counselling room, and I explore this quite a bit in the latest book I've written, which is called Girlhood, because I found that if I used, I'd already done some work in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, so I knew language is important. I'd already done some art therapy work, and I had also done some tapping, which is really at the edge by then, by a psychologist in WA called Steve Wells. And every now and then I'd kind of weave that in amongst the therapy, but the changes that were happening were like, I'd often only need to see them once. Parents thought I was a bit like a witch, I think. But when I changed the video in a child's head, and of course, girls are incredibly imaginative. I'll give you a really simple example. I did some work. This girl was really quite sad, particularly at home, and her, they'd taken it to a GP, and, they were quite concerned. She was, pretty well coming up with all the flags for depression for a 5-year-old. Anyway, when she came, I do colour breathing with them, so they can pretend they can breathe out whatever the yucky feelings they have. And afterwards, I still felt I wasn't feeling right. Anyway, I have a magic wand, and I said to this little 5-year-old girl, I said, do you believe in magic? She said yes. I said, well, this is my magic wand. I said, if you could do abracadabra and you could wish away whatever's making you sad, would you like to do that? She said, oh, yes, I would. And so she got it, and she went, abracadabra, I just wish my daddy would play with me sometimes. And, she had a loving dad. He just wasn't into it. And it was well before Bluey, of course, which would teach you how to do that, which was so easily fixed. And that little girl's dad was able to turn up a few times a week, and that little girl just bounced back into being a happy little girl. And I thought, wow, look at that weave between, the imagination and real, and we know that. And so that's kind of what led me also to the visualizations. I ended up in 1998 winning a Rotary scholarship for study kind of thing. So I ended up at Jack Canfield's facilitating school seminar in Santa Barbara in America. Can you believe that, from this little girl from the bush? Anyway, it was a full-on, like we worked from 9 till probably 9 most night, doing all sorts of techniques and strategies. And it was the second time I'd been using relaxations, visualization, but I hadn't used them to change behavior. And I was really fascinated. And there was one from Gerald Topolsky, who was quite a well-known guy at the time, about improving children's reading if you change their negative attitude in their head. And so that was one I kind of went back with. But I also ended up with a class of year 9s, very not so much at risk, but just completely disengaged. There was about 15 boys. They basically worn out every teacher who had them. So I'd come back from America and said, okay, I've got them for a term. And I started every Monday morning, they would do a visualization when they took home their best report card ever, because they'd never taken one home. So how can you take home something when your expectation is in the opposite direction? I just went to basic psychology. So I did this visualization where they saw themselves holding a report card with grades they'd never gotten. I didn't take them from Fs to As. I took them to Cs and Bs. I wasn't stretching it too far. But then there were the comments that no one ever said about them. So I made sure they were on it. And they saw themselves take that report card and take it into their parents. And they saw their parents' faces. And when they did it, no matter how many times in that, we did it for about 8 weeks, their faces, just you see their faces change as their parents are showing pride in them for the first time. And then at the end, they had to take it into their room and pin it on their board and went, I did this. Anyway, so we were doing that. They were not letting anybody know in the playground what was going on. They just said, she lets us have a rest on Mondays, because it was so weird. And they're boys. They don't want to go, well, she's woo-woo. And then about week 4, I had a couple of maths teachers come up to me and said, what are you doing with those grommets? What are you doing? Because they started to hand work in. And I went, oh, serious? Maths work, right? Anyway, next time I had them, I said, hey, so I've just been had a whisper that some of you boys are handing in your maths work. And I took to one of the boys, said, yeah, God, I am. I'll never normally do that. And that's when what happens. So what happens when you change the expectation of the student? You change the expectation of the teacher. So then teachers are more engaged with, they want more of that juice. And it was stunning, really, because that was literally, they had to still do their 5 assessments with me. But before they did it, they turned all their brain buttons on, whatever that means. They, in other words, got prepared mentally for it. They saw the possibility of doing well. Anyway, they all got the best report cards I'd ever had in their lives. And I'd promised them a chocolate frog if it failed. That was enough. I mean, I still gave them the chocolate frogs. But when they came into the class on that last day and showed me those report cards, I just burst into tears. One lad had gone from literally, he's actually really, really bright, which was so pissed off at everything and everyone. He ended up being sent off to an elite private school, which had a cricket program that he was really interested in. So and then what was really interesting was I run into those boys over the years before I left that town who can still remember that they stayed in them. If I want to do something, I see it in my head first. I still do that. So I knew we could do more than we do. And so that's why I've continued on that journey. I've got a whole heap of them. Calming the Angry Ant is a really popular one with angry little boys from K to probably year 3. But it actually calms girls down as well as teachers. So you can see, once again, we can create crazy things that can make differences. Another one that's incredibly popular is I'm a Good Friend, because not all kids have picked up the social cues, particularly our neurodivergent kids. And I had a teacher who has some very difficult little boys who are in a very low socioeconomic areas, lots of gang stuff in the area. And in the visualization, she'd used it a couple of times. They pretend they have a puppy on their tummy to start with and that they stroke, because we wanted them to get a sensation of what it feels like to be cared for. Because for so many, that hasn't happened. Anyway, and she said to me, it worked brilliantly except for these 3 boys. So she went and got a stuffed toy for them, because I couldn't do the pretend imaginary. So those 3 little boys had a pretend stuffed toy on their chest. And then they basically go into the classroom with the same feeling on their face, the smile on their face, and they greet kids. So we do some welcoming and farewell strategies. We talk about sometimes being a good friend means we don't always go first, or we let our friends go first, or sometimes, be careful not to be too bossy, which of course was me. Anyway, she said to me, as soon as I got that little stuffed toy, those 3 little boys were right onto it. And she said, we've just changed their whole social dynamic. She said, and it just, as she said, it's just brought pure joy to my whole class that every now and then you'll hear a voice say, but that's not being a good friend. But also she said a big message in it, and I just want to thank you for that, is that they need to be a good friend to themselves. And I think that sometimes, what are we doing in psychology is helping people learn to love and accept themselves as they are. And sometimes that's hard, but when you've got 5 and 6-year-old boys who, are forever getting busted for their impulsivity and their inappropriate, sometimes toilet humor and, farting in the wrong places, it's lovely that suddenly someone's saying it's okay. You need to be kind to yourself. You need to like who you are, even if sometimes you make poor choices. So sorry that was a long-winded answer, but I just felt I wanted to give you a couple of examples of what kind of blew my head away kind of while I was still in the classroom.
No, Maggie, thank you for speaking so in so much detail and at length, because what it really, I think, exemplifies is that it's not that you have any expert strategy, but you're an expert in throwing strategies that are informed, that are considered. And by virtue of doing that is you'll go to a course, you'll pick up those skills, or you'll learn from your own experience and say, how does it apply to another context? And the fact that you're being deliberate in doing something different, you're then taking feedback from that and once again tweaking that over and over until I think, we can clearly say you are an expert, but not in the strategy, but rather in the process. And that's what I'm hearing is really the, immense value that you bring, with your books and your podcast. I listened to one of your podcasts about a gentleman talking about his son was finding it really difficult, being quite critical of himself, trying to be perfectionistic, and you spoke about how the father could model making errors, not getting it right. And interestingly, my daughter's very perfectionistic, and from a very young age, she started to scrunch up her artwork and throw it in the bin. She was trying to get it right. And I remember sitting there on so many occasions scribbling out of the lines next to her, which let me tell you is not easy for me because I have that conscientious perfectionistic streak.
I wonder where she got it from.
And so I was working at it, and that stuff pays off. And I didn't know it was going to work, but you need to be throwing something and at least be informed at a level. And the way that you just spoke about it, really sings to that, and is beautiful because, the expert keeps trying and keeps trying to be informed, and that's what you're providing with all these books and podcasts and videos and so on. And I think there's a lot to be said about the process and the attitude, the validating attitude also has to come with that process that, is very liberating, that, we're not here to get it right. We're here to, continue on that process and try and be, try and be parents and not a good one, not a bad one. We're trying to continue to do our parenting. And obviously when we're frustrated, it's not easy to do that, but that's okay too, because that's a part of it as well. And once again, kids need to see that also, how we resolve our own frustrations is important too.
Oh, look, I think one other thing, we really need to get much better at celebrating the gifts that can come with failing, and I've written a lot of blogs around this, that, we all think that's a sign that, we've not hit the mark. And, with mistake, what it eventually meant was you've just missed the target temporarily. Like when kids have got parents who model that now, not, into even from a very early age, when they spill their milk or they, whatever, that we go, whoops, the daisy, how are we going to clean that up? Like we just don't do that over the top. And the same with, a failed test and things like that. I know that we can feel disappointed because our child's not suddenly performing, but we have to celebrate that the ability to recover from a disappointment or a failure or a setback is a process again, isn't it? And I really celebrate the fact that what we want is for when our kids are teens and they will make some poor choices that are really challenging to them, and they're in that risky window where we know, they can make impulsive poor choices around intentional self-harm, that rather than that, they can lean back on a grown-up who's failed in front of them many times. I look at that with my own sons. There were times they crashed cars and did things that I wish they hadn't done, but they reached out for me. And that's when we've got there in that space. When we put too much pressure on, and that's exactly what's coming up in nearly every year in the Mission Australia Youth Survey, is that pressure. The anxiety is one thing, and stress, managing it, but the pressure to perform at school, like we want our kids to do well. But when we put too much pressure and we are a little unrealistic because they're dealing with a very different world than what we had, there's much more nastiness out there. There's more capacity for them to have a sense of living in a safe, secure world. Many of them are really worried that is there going to be one. They are really concerned about climate. They're really concerned about the war in Ukraine. They're really concerned about suicide. And yet, if we don't have grown-ups who allow them to have these big conversations who they can lean on without having to do a lecture in the middle of it, how do they prepare themselves to step out off into the big wide world? One of my biggest things around resilience is, what are their life skills? What are we putting in their kit bag for life? I've called it the kit bag for 20 years. If you've got skills in that kit bag, your chances of surviving adversity are so much higher. But if you have to, as soon as you walk out the door, ring or, text your mum about where's this? What's that? I had sons who weren't really good at remembering stuff. And the hardest thing I had when they kind of gradually left, one by one, to live in Perth, which is 5 hours from Albany, to go to uni, was I wasn't around the corner. So I consciously knew that to learn how to navigate the social world of parties and things, they would need to be in it. But I didn't actually let them out until they were in year 11, the year they turned 16, because I also knew about brain, and I knew the brain under 16 is a lot more dicey than the one over. They didn't like that, and they did escape to a few parties which they think I didn't know about, which is also what teens are supposed to do. But I wanted them to navigate that journey before they got to Perth at a university. There's a whole different world if you've got, young people. I wanted them to make the mistakes while I could still pick them up. I wanted them to know there were some clear guidelines, and I had conversations with them, which was interesting because it was just intuitive. When they went to parties, I had some clear rules. You don't get in a car with anyone who's been drinking. Yep. And if you're worried, you call me, I'll pick you up, or I'm going to get you to pick up with the cab, or you walk home, right? And another one, big one, overarching one, was watch out for your mates. I want you to watch out for your mates. It's such an important thing. I don't want you to just be such a selfish person. It's just about you. I want you to, the number of times they called me because one of their mates was in problem, the number of times that I heard many months later how they had supported a young person who was, in a vulnerable position. And the other one was, what do you do if? Because I wanted to see, they're not thick. They do know a fair bit. What are you going to do if one of your friends falls on the ground in an alcoholic coma? What are you going to do? And I talked to them about, we just put them in a recovery position and call an ambulance straight away. I don't care where you are. Don't mess around. You can die. And I taught kids for years when I was still working with them in school systems. This is, you become I call it the silent protector. You pinch the car keys from the boys who are going to go likely to do burnouts and hide them somewhere. You call an ambulance if that happens. And there have been 2 different occasions that young people have contacted me later to say, thank you for telling me about that alcoholic coma, because I was at a party and one of the guys there just flaked out on the ground. I knew he wasn't asleep, put him in the recovery position, called an ambo. And when the paramedic was actually getting them into the ambulance, it turned and said, who called the ambulance? And this kid put his hand up and he said, I just need to, how come you called? Because it doesn't happen often. And he said, I had someone who told me it was really important. He said, well, do you realise he's 2 minutes away from death? You've just saved this kid's life. And I've had that happen twice. So I believe when we empower teens to be the rescuers and to be the helpers rather than just doom and gloom on them, we give them the capacity that I think is inside every human to step up and do the right thing. And I don't know that we call on that enough. I think we keep calling on the doom and gloom. And I'm really passionate about giving them those life skills. What do you do if you come across a car accident? We know the unsafest part of it, going to a party, is how you get home. I have worked in communities after 4 young people have been killed in a car accident following a party. My own sons lost 2 of their mates following a car accident. And those weeks afterwards were really tough for them and their teachers. And I work with the staff because I've got to do so much in the death and dying space. But I wanted that trauma to not only be something they overcome eventually, but I wanted to make sure it leaves a benefit in their life. And the number of them that, are so different. My sons are very different from then on. They go to funerals and they can cry with their mates. There's no more of this blocking it up because boys don't cry. They turn up and check in on their mates. They do the things that they've learnt because they've gone through that awful experience, and people have guided them and let them know this was okay. And even one of them, one of the groups, about a month afterwards, I knew they were still struggling a fair bit, but their mates were surfers and they were all surfers, and they wanted to have a night on a beach. And I know a lot of the parents are really worried, basically this could end up badly. But we facilitated it. So they had a big bonfire. We checked with the council, could they have a bonfire? We had parents turn up with burgers at 11 o'clock at night, and blankets because some forgot to get them. We turned up with breakfast next day. They just needed some solo kind of space under a starry night sky to kind of put a bit more ritual on their terms for the farewell of those 2 beautiful mates. And I'm, like I said, at the end of the day, when we can take those adverse moments and, work with them in a way that they feel they've still got agency in the process of the grief, rather than people telling them how they should grieve. I hope that makes sense.
It resonates at so many levels because it really goes out and empowers young people to make those decisions and do what's right for them. And also it recognises they have capacity to make good choices. And by saying, look after your mates, that's a whole cultural idea. That's not do not get into a vehicle with a drunk person, which is still good advice. But it's because it overarches every scenario, and every scenario can have a look after your mates. And it could be preempting that they're already drinking too much, that you might slow them down or distract them. It might be that someone's emotionally upset, so you go out and check in and say, hey, how you going? Could be that you just go out and give someone some water when they need to. Someone's fallen over, so you go out and bandage them up or brush off their graze. Irrespective of what it is, that there's a real capacity building exercise going in there by saying, look after your mates, and in another way of saying, how do you want to grieve your loved one, and they get to choose that as well. And yes, parents can still facilitate that. Let's go out and take those measures. Let's bring burgers late at night so they're fed, that, there's not too much alcohol involved. Let's make sure they've got something warm over them because we don't want them to freeze, et cetera, et cetera. It kind of says we can do this in a really respectful way, but in your way,
I also think something really important is, if that's your first experience of death as a close mate or friend, and girls have got to be even more cautious of, because sometimes they're biologically wired to want to rescue their friends and they forget about themselves, and that can end up, not being a healthy thing. But you've got to let your kids experience death or around it, not protect them. So how many families have said, oh no, we sent the dog off to the farm when they had it put down because they didn't want to upset their kids? Upset them before 5. Get the guinea pig and hope it dies, because I know that, the children that I work with around death and dying, while I was driving a coach or I was preparing a ceremony, the ones that had been through a death of a loved one in terms of mainly pets, but maybe a grandparent, they handled those losses as troubled and emotional teens so much better. And it just came to mind this beautiful 14-year-old boy and their family that I worked with when I was still in Albany. And the boy had developed this aggressive tumor on his shoulder blade that was just so rare. And it took about 8 months before it killed him. And yet we watched his friends, he had 2 girl mates and 2 boy mates, turn up most afternoons after school. They got a king-size bed, so they could all sit on the bed. They watched his favourite things on TV and footy and stuff, and they had this open conversation. He could talk to them, about the treatments he was having and showing him where the port went for the, chemo, and it wasn't hidden. And I still remember, it's about, he was getting weaker and we knew things were going downhill. And he said to me, Maggie, can we get my coffin delivered into my bedroom before I die, for a 14-year-old lad? And I said, we could organise that. I said, what colour do you want it? And he said, I want Ferrari red. So we got this Ferrari red coffin delivered. And he asked his best mates to write stuff all over it. So this just was written all over, right? And I still remember this because it really tears me up a bit. But on the funeral day, the funeral was kind of led by his best friends rather than grown-ups. I kind of facilitated around the edges, but one of the friends got up and said, you'll notice that there are messages written all over this casket. And he looked down at the mum and dad and said, he's asked us to tell you that he's written a very special message for you at that end that they didn't know about. So to be told from beyond death how much you are loved by a 14-year-old boy, it took me days really to be able to see that we underestimate them so often, but with the right people guiding you on the toughest journeys of life, it facilitates healing on the other side. That, that boy just transformed so many lives. It was like I said, it was such an honor and a privilege to be part of that journey. And he taught me so much. Like I said, you don't always learn your greatest lessons in life from textbooks or courses. You learn them from other humans if you're prepared to be humble enough to step back and listen with an open heart. And it was one of those beautiful journeys where everything I knew about death flipped upside down again. And I think, that the importance of celebrating and honouring lives at funerals rather than just farewelling them was something we had to kind of flip over a bit, and it took quite a lot of time. And nowadays, gosh, you can laugh a lot at a funeral now, and the music can have you wanting to dance in the aisles. Like, we've really learned that only 2 of the 3 things around a farewell ceremony hurt. I mean, are good, and the other one hurts. So it's the farewell part, but it's the celebration and honouring that can just fill your heart with such joy. And I do remember teens saying to me at one point, why do they have a party after you've had a funeral, Maggie? And I said, it's not really just a party. So what a wake really is about a safe kind of space for the people who really love and respect that person to share stories that they can't fit into a ceremony, to just hug people, because sometimes we haven't got enough words, and I can still remember that with some of the ones I did where a young lad has died who was in a football team and a football club, which can be a place that can be a bit, man boxy, about toughness and, alcohol and everything. And yet when someone dies, they can often do it unbelievably well. And the line of honour that his coffin was marched through with all these young boys in their footy jumpers was just, and nobody told them as it got to the chapel door to clap, but a couple of the boys started clapping. And that took it to another level of celebrating as that boy was coming in for his final farewell ceremony. It was, like I said, there were those moments that as humans, we can be uplifted in the most adverse situations. And I still keep saying adversity is not all bad, like, am I an incredibly resilient human because of my experiences on the farm? Probably. But also, I wasn't, we had to work on the farm. We were part of the free labour. No one could shift all the sheep or, like pick up rocks and do burning off without all us kids helping. Like, is that where my work ethic came from? Or is that where it came on that says we just pitch in and do it because that's what we do to help our family and our system? When I hear of families where kids don't do any chores, there's a part of me there who, yep, we know the research is strong in that area, that the kids who do regular chores tend to turn out better because they're helpers. They're doing what needs to happen to help a family and a system survive. We're biologically wired, though, and Ness, I'd love your thoughts on this too. We're biologically wired to live as social beings. So I'm a little concerned that our digital natives today, especially those who are marinated in, endless gaming, hours of pornography, or endless contacting via screens, how are they going to be able to thrive in intimate relationships as adults? Are they just going to do it through their phones? I'm just worried. We're not sitting around tables talking. We're not having as much conversation. Little children aren't having as much FaceTime as they've had before. Are we changing humanity, and is that just a different way of being in relationships? I know it's a big question, but I'm a little bit worried.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. It's concerning. I have an extremely optimistic streak in me, so I tend to just believe that things will work out, and that I'm sure the previous generations were absolutely terrified about the miniskirts and the TVs and the radios going to take everyone away from each other and so on. I think our biology is so strong that yes, this might be a great shift, but whether we like it or not, we are still human, and so we just gravitate to that. I know here in our practice, as much as we provide telehealth, our clients do not choose telehealth. No. They come back, and this is during the entire COVID period. So we gave the options. People would rather cancel an appointment than do it via tele, and it doesn't mean that tele isn't useful, and it doesn't mean that tele doesn't have a space, particularly rural and in places where you can't easily access a psychologist or other services. But we want to have a human experience, and so I think we would just naturally gravitate. Yeah. Has the world changed? We're staring at our phones all the time. Yes, absolutely. Will that have an effect? You bet. I mean, the research will show that. Will that change?
We can still send lots of love messages, and can't we? You know what I mean? Across the board. I couldn't communicate with my teen sons because I didn't have phones when they were around about. But I know that there are parents who, send great messages to their kids everywhere. And I thought I would have loved that when they were at uni. So you're absolutely right. And I do believe, having got back on the road in the last month, the hunger at conferences, the hunger in our restaurants and cafes and markets is palpable. Does it matter? We've all got, some of us still have to wear masks because we're a little bit wary of flu and everything. No, it doesn't. But there is an absolute palpable hunger for us to have humans around again. And I do believe that our families and our neighbourhoods is the key to moving forward. And I know there are lots of families that have changed the way that they run their families as a consequence of having gone through lockdowns, where kids now have neighbourhood friends they didn't have before because they were all in lockdown. Other families have also chosen to not do weekend sport because the kids really loved going on treks or long bike rides with their folks, and they're going to keep doing that. So I thought, we just got to work out what works for our family, how do we make it work for our family instead of just looking around at what everyone else is doing? What works best for our family that allows us to have the strongest sense of loving connection and enjoy being together, whatever that may be. So if you enjoyed making sourdough, just knock yourself out, really. I've just gone back to pikelets. They're a lot easier. But I do think just having the conversations around the dining table from time to time about what's working in our family and what's not, and how can we problem solve the stuff that's not working? Because I think that put it out on the table. Don't make parents always having to solve the problems. Let's work through some solutions together while we eat ice cream.
Look, I think that's one of the profound things that I see in the work that you do is that you're tabling all these conversations with young people, and so the question around screen time is, most likely best to be done with those young people and say, what do you think is most appropriate? And I've heard you give that type of advice and at different levels and for different topics, and it's incredible. And this is what, obviously, teaching probably 101 in a dip ed goes out and it says involve the classroom, let them set the rules of the classroom and then they own it. And I remember as a young man, young boy when I was growing up, the teachers that said, what do we want the classroom rules to be? I had no idea that they were running the show and that, I thought that I was somehow contributing. But I was owning it because it was mine rather than theirs. And anytime we stepped over the mark, they would pull that in because it would be unreasonable. But they still allowed us, to have enough responsibility and ownership. And I think, screen time would be probably another one. And every parent would do it different. Some would say an hour a day. Some will say 3 hours a day. Others will say only on weekends. I don't know what the rules are. I don't know how it works. I think we can all work it out. But it is still concerning because we don't know how to do it yet. We're all still grappling with it. Whether it's educators, whether it's parents.
And who would have thought? Here we are having this chat, and it was interesting because I was actually able to use the online platform to reach so many more people during the pandemic. I mean, some of my webinars, we had people sign up from places like Peru, Paraguay, Afghanistan, Chile, like
mind-boggling.
Poland. And then the other thing that also happened was because I had that balanced view, I was running one called Parenting in a Pandemic where, I was giving parents some context around you have your children home who are supposed to be online learning. You are supposed to be working full time. You may have two parents. I'm just going to give you some practical things around that. You just can't do it all, right? Anyway, it took off like randomly. And all of a sudden I had about 80 schools wanting to run it. So I contacted the New South Wales Primary Principals Association and said, how about you pay me to do one and you just send it out to as many schools as you like? And he thought that's such a good idea. Now, 265 schools signed up within 2 hours, which takes it to 10,000 on the platform. So he contacted me. I said, yeah, sure, I'll do it twice. No problem. And the feedback they got afterwards was the reassurance didn't just go to parents. It went to teachers as well, for that they were being recognised that how difficult this was and that we can do pockets of this really well. We just can't do 100%, all of it. It's impossible. And we're also living in a time of fear and we're also all far more stressed than we normally are. So that common sense that I guess I am called the queen of common sense apparently really did resonate right across the board. And that was lucky. I couldn't have done that without the digital platform. So there are these unexpected gifts that every now and then turn up that I go, oh, that's kind of handy. But you're absolutely right that I don't think it'll ever, it's how do we use it to our advantage? And you're right that parents say to me, how many hours is okay for kids? And I go, it's what you're doing with it. It's what you're doing with it. It's such a difference if you're doing with your daughter how to draw a unicorn little thingamajiggy, which is fantastic because I've done it with one of my granddaughters, than doing a game where they're getting rewarded. So we're building a kind of hunger for be a gambler later because the dopamine receptor system gets over agitated, or they're needing to be entertained every second. That's different. Yeah. And are you with them? Are you doing it? Because I know there's lots of parents who got that message during the pandemic who now sit down with their kids when they're doing Minecraft and get really engaged in the whole creativity of the underside of it, right? So it hasn't become this giant enemy. It's, again, what can we do together that helps me understand the joy you get from that? And then guess what? We're going out on the trampoline. Oh, we're going to walk the dog. Oh, we're going to get outside and climb a tree. Right? It's the displacement effect that I think when you recognize that, particularly in the early years, then we can address those without necessarily doing the blame shame game, because I'm just, like I said, I'm a huge fan of TV over the handheld device for as long as possible for all the reasons that I've already touched on. Plus, that means they can sit on Nanny's lap and we can watch Bluey together, or, sometimes it's all about dinosaurs. You won't believe what I know about dinosaurs, thanks to one of my grandsons. So follow a passion for sure. But if there's a place where, and yes, you will have a techno tantrum if you take something off a child who's enjoying it. Try taking one of my murder crime mystery books off me while I'm engaged, and you'll get a tantrum from me as well. Like, let's be real about those things.
Yeah.
And thankfully, we're getting lots more information around how it is actually shaping possibly our brain in not a positive way with too much of it, particularly either the gaming side for boys, delaying the prefrontal growth, but also we know the harm that can be happening from too much of Instagram for our girls and that whole body image stuff. So we've got there's evidence out there already that shows we need to address some of those concerns. We can't just, off you go. And I do think one of the best pieces of advice is that we have any devices are out in the main area of the house, not the bedroom, because no one's going to take a photograph of their private parts in the lounge room.
Absolutely. Maggie, I could speak with you for so many hours, and I wish we had another 6 hours to run, but I am mindful of time. Can you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and obviously the resources to continue on with this conversation? There's so much out there.
Oh, okay. Look, MaggieDent.com is absolutely packed full of, articles and blogs and access to audios that you can find for free. The Parental As Anything podcast has 5 series, which covers everything from tweens to teens. My YouTube channel has over 125 videos on it. So once again, as my boys, I can remember them saying, like, I was only about 8 years into this whole journey, and one of them said, Mum, when you Google your name, you've got 5 pages. I'd hate to think what's out there now. So, yeah, it's not hard to find my stuff, and there's a lot of it available for free. And if any of my blogs or articles or videos can support any of your clients, use it and share, because that's the other thing. I have got a number of psychologists who use some of my visualizations as add-ons, and I don't need to know about that. You're never going to have any problem with using any of my stuff to support the transformation and healing of any child or any adult. So that's another space out there that's very different to mainstream, because at the end of the day, what we want is everyone to be as healthy and happy as possible.
Beautifully said, and thank you very much for being so generous to come into the show today and obviously share with us lots of tips and strategies and your viewpoints. I think there's a lot to take away, and for everyone to go, I think, to your website, the podcast Mental As Anything, and all your books. Is it really good to I think get your hands on and try and understand, young people in a different way, change your own perspective and learn and grow. So thank you again, Maggie. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ness.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.